Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila, and our story today is called Charlie and the Writhing Monster. Well, I generally don't tell stories about a monster, but this is a different kind of monster. This story was written by Josephine Cunningham Edwards. When I was a little girl, and before I was a little girl, she was one of the best storytellers there ever was. And all the stories she told were stories that she and her family had lived through. She had been a missionary with her husband and her son Charlie to Africa. But this story, they're back in the United States, and she and her family lived in Minneapolis in Minnesota. Well, enough of that. Now for the story. Josephine, she was in their apartment. They lived in a second-story apartment in Minneapolis. Well, she looked around the little apartment, and it was all nice and clean. Everything was in place. And she thought, well, since everybody else is gone, her husband and her son Charlie had gone to Anoka to set up the tents and things for a church camp meeting and the great big tents for the meetings they were going to have. They had been there several days. Well, she thought, I seldom get time on my own. So she went and she got some paper and pencils, and she sat down and she thought, I have another story I'd like to write. So that's what she started to do. But she didn't get very far before that phone rang, and it was her husband. And she said, is everything okay there? And he said, yeah, it's okay. And she said, are you sure? And he said, we're just kind of lonesome for you, Charlie and I. We would love it if you just get in the car and come here and be with us. Just come stay here in the tent with us. So she agreed. So she put away her pencils and her papers. So much for that story. Then she got busy packing very quickly so she could be there. And she packed blankets and quilts, a couple rugs, a set of curtains. There was mosquito netting, a hot plate for them to cook food on, dishes, a few kettles, all the specific things, and of course her suitcase and stuff. She looked around and she thought, I think I've got everything. Her husband had said, and by the way, we're getting eaten by the mosquitoes. So she knew that he wanted her to bring the mosquito netting. So then she went down those stairs, down to the bottom, and loaded all of her stuff in the car. She was really glad that she'd washed the car that morning. When she had everything neatly in the car, and she looked around to make sure she had everything, she set off. When she arrived at the town of Anoka in Minnesota, she came to the gate of the camp meeting area. It looked like a huge, big park, and there were hundreds of tents already set up, just waiting for when the people would come to live in them for the next 2 weeks. Well, before she could even drive in, here came Charlie. Charlie was 12, and he was anxious to see his mom. And she stopped the car, and he came running to the window, and he said, oh, good, you're here, Mom. Did you bring anything to eat? Did you bring some cookies? Well, Mom just laughed. He got in the car, and he showed his mom where their tent was. So she parked the car right there beside it, and she and Charlie took everything out of the car. and put it inside that tent. Well, just like any mom would do, the first thing she did was look around to make this tent into a home. She had brought along a fold-up bed, and so they put that up, and they put sheets and quilts and things on it, and she'd made a bed for Charlie. She put down a rug on the floor so they weren't walking on those splintery pieces of wood that was the bottom of the tent. Those tents were just frameworks with a little side wall that came up the side that was wooden, and then the floors were made out of 2x4s, and then they had a framework that went up that made it shaped like this. And they had tent tops that they put over those and tied them down to that wooden frame, and then people had little bitty tents to live in. Well, she'd gotten the rug on the floor, and then she saw the 2 chairs and the little table that the dad had probably brought along earlier. And so she rearranged all that and put the clothes away. She put the food away. And then she got out that mosquito netting. She was going to put up the mosquito net, and she was going to put up a curtain in the middle of that tent to divide it in half, so their clothes and all that stuff could be in the back where nobody could see them, and there would be just like this cute little living room here in the front. And then she discovered, even though she had looked very carefully before she left that apartment, she forgot the hammer, she forgot the tacks and the pins that she always used to hang the curtain and to hang the mosquito netting. Oh dear, she turned to Charlie. She said, "I'm sorry. The only thing I can do is to drive into town, to Anoka, and to buy some tacks and get a hammer." Well, when she was starting out of the tent to go to the car, there stood one of the other pastors, and he said, "Oh, hi, Josephine." And she said hello, and pretty soon she had told him all about the fact that she had no hammer and she had no tacks. And he said, "Don't worry about it. I know where there's a hammer, and Charlie can go get it. And I have tacks in my tent. I'll be back in a little while with them. You don't have to go to town." Well, Mother then went back into the tent and was fussing about putting things here, there, and everywhere, when she heard somebody shouting. And she ran out of the tent to look. And it was Charlie. He was running between those tents, kind of making a zigzaggy path toward her. And he said, "A tornado, Mom, a tornado." Oh my, Josephine. Then Josephine thought, on her way, she'd stopped at a gas station, and a kind gas station attendant had come out, and he said, "Strange weather, ain't it, ma'am?" And she said, "Yes." He said, "My father always said this was tornado weather." Well, Josephine had never lived anywhere where there was tornadoes, and she had never been in a tornado. And she kind of asked him, she said, "Can this really be tornado weather?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am. My father always said so. You know, a tornado is when there's cold air up in the sky, and there's hot air, and they're hitting together. And when the cold and the hot air hit, they make a turning of the clouds, and it starts going round and round and round and round, great big on the top and little narrow on the bottom, a big funnel that goes whirling around and round and round. And that whirling sucks up things into the bottom of the tornado. Well, Mother had not been excited about that news, and now here was Charlie shouting, "Tornado, Mom, tornado!" Mother went out to look, and in the distance, she could see that big tornado up in the air. It was going round and round and round, and it had a long tail that went down behind it. And she could see that it was picking up things. It was pulling trees up out of the ground, just like you'd pull carrots out of your garden when it was wet. It was just going, and the tree would be sucked up in the air. It was pulling off the tops of barns, and houses were crumbling, and sheds and fences and hay bales, and people and animals were all being whirled around in that. Well, Father came running, and Charlie said, Mother, are we gonna die?" And Josephine looked seriously at him, and she said, "I'm sorry, but I think so." That tornado was coming right toward them, right toward all those tents. Father said, "Get in the car." Well, he knew better than to try to drive away, but he thought getting in the car, at least they'd have some protection if things were starting to fly about and hitting things. When they got in the car, the noise was deafening, and Mother said, "We should pray." So they knelt in that car, and Charlie prayed. He prayed a beautiful prayer, asking God to forgive him of all their sins, all the silly things that they did they knew they weren't supposed to do. And he asked God to take him to a better life. Well, the three of them had prayed, and Charlie said, "Mom, how long till we die?" She looked out the window and she said, "Charlie, I think about 3 minutes." Now they couldn't even hear because the noise was so loud. It was like 1,000 freight trains. It was like tons of sawmills all running at once. It was unbelievable. There was nothing they could do but sit there and wait for it to happen. It was getting closer and closer and closer. They could see that stuff going around, that tornado. And they were sure they would probably be next. But God, only God, could have done this. God turned that tornado around, and as fast as it had been coming toward them, it went the other way. They were amazed. God had saved them. Not only them, but not one of those tents for the camp meeting was knocked down or sucked up into that tornado. All the workers there that were working to get the meetings ready for the people, to tell other people about God, nobody was hurt. Nobody at all. But down that road that Mother Josephine would have had to have gone on to buy those tacks and a hammer, everyone that had been on that road, all the houses beside it, all the animals, all the cars, all the people, had all been swept up in that tornado. and the whole town where she would have gone was totally destroyed. It would take years to rebuild what that tornado had destroyed in a very short amount of time. After they caught their breaths and their hearts settled down from its hard thumping, they thanked God like they'd never thanked God for anything before, and they rededicated their lives to serve Him. And you know, I can say that that is exactly what they did. Now, Josephine's been gone for many, many years, but I know that she and her family are waiting for Jesus to come. And do you know, we, all of us, serve a God that's able to even turn a tornado around. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.